Well, good afternoon. I know that we are still joining, but want to get started. I know we always have a lot to discuss. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the second session of the 4-session series on skills for psychological recovery. We're really pleased to have everyone with you. I think most of you probably received and know that after today's session, we'll make sure to send out a copy or a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slides and any other materials that are discussed. So I'll hand it off to Melissa, who will get us started today.
Wonderful. And thank you, Robert. Welcome back, everybody. My name is Melissa Maris, and I'm pleased to be here to co-facilitate our second session of the SPR series with my colleagues, Drs. Erin Hambrick and Joa Williams. And we are excited to be here today. Also wanted to thank Christy for steering our slideshow today, and of course the entire team who helped support this entire enterprise. So if we can go to the next slide, Christy. In terms of project disclosures, we just wanted to share that we do not have any financial relationships we need to disclose. We are not trying to sell you anything. We don't have any commercial interests. And then, Christy, if you can go to the next slide. In terms of mitigating potential bias, we are going to be sharing with you the best from what we know of the evidence base right now. And so we are going to be sharing information that is fact and science-based and what is currently accepted within the profession. If we can go to the next slide, Christy. And then as Robert already shared, after the session today, we will be sending out a link to the presentation slides and then also the chat log. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And we have some reading here that we would encourage you to pursue. And we'll give you a reminder at the very end as well in terms of looking through the SPR manual. So with that, I am going to hand this over to Joa.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Glad to see so many folks back here this week as we kind of continue the discussion on SPR and thinking about some of the steps involved in this process and hopefully can, again, continue the discussion about how to adapt some of the things that we're going to talk about for some of the specific populations that you all work with. And again, feel free to jump in and ask questions at any point as we go through some of this, as I talk about different steps kind of involved in any of this. If I say anything that you'd like additional clarity on, or if folks have questions or comments, please feel free to unmute and chime in. Otherwise, feel free to post your questions, in the chat, and I'll try to monitor those carefully and field any questions that come through that way. But you'll remember just last week as a recap, I think most folks were probably here for our initial session last week, but we started by talking about a general overview of what skills for psychological recovery is and how a model like this can be useful along the continuum of care for trauma and disaster exposed youth, families, and adults and other individuals. And, just as kind of a reminder, this is really an approach that's going to be a bit more involved than something like psychological first aid, which is typically an acute sort of immediate intervention delivered in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or disaster. Whereas the kinds of skills that we're really going to be talking about for the next 3 weeks, the core skills of SPR, skills for psychological recovery, are skills that are largely going to be appropriate for helping people learn how to manage some of the secondary stressors that just continue to sort of be an important part of what many people encounter once the initial sort of crisis phase has largely resolved, right, in the immediate aftermath of a trauma or disaster. So we're going to talk a bit about 2 specific skills today. We're going to talk about problem solving, and then we're going to skip ahead a bit in terms of how they're ordered in the manual and talk a bit about rebuilding healthy social support and talk about some specific steps involved in that. But first, I'll start by talking about problem solving. I'm going to give you an overview of what this module actually involves and some of the steps involved in this. And we'll talk about some situations and times where you might find problem solving to be particularly useful for folks. So again, remember that the very first thing that we want to do in any contact that we have using the SPR framework is to start with the first sort of core skill that we talked about last week, information gathering and prioritizing assistance, right? To decide which of the remaining modules and skills are going to be useful for folks we really need to have a good sense of sort of what kinds of things continue to be most problematic for folks, or sort of what things continue to be most concerning, or where folks seem to be struggling the most in the sort of weeks and months that follow after exposure to trauma or disaster. So once we start by gathering information about things like physical health needs, emotional distress, safety, basic needs, role functioning, interpersonal functioning, alcohol and substance use, and whether there are any concerns there, then we can decide whether or not some of the remaining sort of modules here are going to be appropriate. And one module that I'll say, both in terms of my own work sort of anecdotally, and then I think in some of the research that's starting to come out on SPR, you'll also see this same sort of trend, that I think problem solving is actually one that people tend to use quite a bit. So this is a module that's going to be relevant for a whole lot of problems, for a whole lot of concerns that folks will encounter. And I think it's also kind of a it can seem deceptively simple, but actually I think there's a real art to how we do problem solving that I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about today. And we'll talk about just how relevant and practical this can be for folks. And so I think this is a core skill that many of you will find in doing this kind of work that you actually tend to use quite a lot with people. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll talk a bit about sort of what problem solving is and who this might be useful for, right? Well, problem solving really is exactly what it sounds like. It's basically a skill, a set of steps and strategies that can help people begin to have a stronger sense of being able to solve different kinds of challenges that come our way. And certainly in the context of disaster and trauma, there are a lot of secondary kinds of challenges that can certainly come our way. So this is just a basic skill set that can be really, really useful for people and trying to find ways to sort of tackle a lot of different challenges that they may encounter. So who is this going to be appropriate for? Well, this is largely a skill that I think will be appropriate for folks who, in the course of the information gathering phase, sort of identify a lot of different problems. So oftentimes we may have a number of different problems related to the trauma or the disaster that we've experienced. And having multiple problems kind of piling up can feel really overwhelming for anyone. And so being able to sort of use these skills to help tackle some of these different problems, I think, can be particularly empowering for folks. This is also a skill that can be really useful for people who maybe don't have multiple problems, but are having difficulty finding a solution to a specific problem or a particular problem they may be having. And throughout the day today, as we sort of talk about different scenarios and we do some role plays and things like that in the second half of our training, we'll talk about some specific examples of what some of these problems and difficulties might look like. But this is also a skill that can be really useful for people who, in the course of information gathering, sort of report feeling really demoralized or feel like they just lack control over kind of figuring out how to manage some of the different pieces and put all the different pieces back together in the wake of trauma or disaster when so many things have been affected. So I think those are some of the key things that you kind of want to keep in mind. Once we ask for information about all those, the different ways that a person's life might have been affected, keep an eye out and sort of listen for whether or not someone's endorsing multiple problems or seems to be identifying one specific challenge that they can't seem to find a solution to, and may feel sort of out of control in that process. And this is a skill that can be really, really useful in these kinds of situations and contexts. So if we go ahead and we move forward to the next slide, we'll just kind of talk a bit about the rationale, because I think, again, understanding the rationale of each of the different skills that we'll be talking about today and in the following weeks can not only enhance our own understanding as providers, but I think it can also help us better explain the rationale to the folks that we're working with, and really kind of enhance buy-in and enhance, and increase the likelihood, I think, that folks will sort of follow through with learning some of these skills when we can sort of explain why we're recommending specific things for certain kinds of challenges. But generally speaking, the rationale for why problem solving is such an important core skill. Trauma and disasters, as we've kind of talked a bit about, and certainly for those of you that were at the PFA training, we talked about this a lot then too, but we all know that trauma and disasters create lots of difficulties that people may encounter, right, in many different areas of our lives. And when we sort of try to figure out how to manage a lot of those different difficulties all at once, or try to manage all those different challenges, again, there's a natural tendency to start to feel really overwhelmed, and we can feel helpless to sort of manage all those different pieces. So breaking problems down into manageable chunks, one thing that I can do at a time, that I can specifically sort of address, find ways to meet that particular challenge, right? And trying to decide which one to work on first can really help restore a sense of control to folks at a time when we may feel like we actually have very little control over things. So the key here is to really try to just think of a lot of different solutions to a problem so that a person has a choice about what to do, feels empowered to sort of think about the different choices that will likely lead to the resolution of a particular chunk of a problem, right? And again, in doing that, we're empowering people to gain a better sense of control, efficacy, sort of competence and mastery. And that can go a long, long way in promoting recovery from residual emotional distress and other kinds of concerns that folks might have related to the trauma. So again, here we just want to help break things down into manageable chunks and think about finding a lot of different solutions to problems. And we'll talk a bit about why that can be so important here in the next few minutes. But then recognizing that this is kind of the rationale, let's talk a bit about the core steps involved in problem solving. And so this is really kind of a 4-step skill. And when you start teaching the skill to folks, you'll want to be sort of progressing through these steps in sort of a sequential order here. So let's go to the next slide and talk about what some of the core steps involved in problem solving actually are. Well, the first thing that we have to do is start by defining the problem, right? And sort of like I was saying before, again, that can sometimes mean that when somebody reports a problem to us that actually involves several different steps or actions to resolve, defining the problem can mean that we break things down into specific actionable steps, okay? And when we get ready to talk about our scenario and breakout rooms today, we'll kind of give an example of this so that you can kind of see what we mean when we talk about defining the problem in terms of its specific component parts and chunks that can be dealt with in terms of specific skill set here. But in addition to defining the problem, breaking it down into manageable chunks, we also want to help folks think about what's the goal of accomplishing that. If I do that, what do I really want the outcome to look like for me and for others around me? So we want to think about what's the goal. And sort of when we talk about what's the goal, basically what is it that we would really like to see happen? What do we need from this? And if we can do that, that's particularly important, I think, for being able to help people brainstorm solutions that are likely going to lead to the best possible outcome. So when we think about brainstorming things, that's exactly what it sounds like. Think through as many different solutions to the specific chunk of the problem that you've broken down as possible. And we actually often recommend to people, think about at least 5 to 10 different solutions for any problem that you identify. And if you can think of even more than that, that's great, right? But the key is to just think through as many solutions as possible to a particular problem. Now, in thinking about problem solving as a skill, I'm curious, why do folks think that brainstorming so many different solutions to a problem is really key? I think that's actually one of the most important parts of this particular skill and this particular exercise. And why do you think that's important? Why do we need to have people or work with people to think through multiple solutions to a specific problem? Curious what folks think about that. In this case, why is more better? Yeah, so yeah, Aaron, so Dr. Hambrick added here, like not every option is going to be viable, right? Not every option is going to be appropriate for a particular situation or context. Even if it might be highly effective, it might not be viable. And so having some backup plans is going to be really, really important as well, and gives folks peace of mind knowing that there's options. Yeah, there can be barriers to blending solutions, right? So, or there's often barriers, so blending solutions is going to be great. And I think that's absolutely it. Everybody's kind of hitting on some important things there, right? Having options is going to be really important. If we're trying to help mitigate feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, yeah, so not letting any problem tear you down. And I appreciate that coming in on chat too. I just saw that. And that's so important, right? Because if we only have a limited range of options that we brainstorm and we pick one of those options to address a particular problem, and you know what, it doesn't lead to the outcome that we wanted, or it doesn't work and the problem is still there. If we don't have any backup options to draw on, we're still probably going to feel kind of hopeless and helpless in terms of managing some of the problems that we're up against, right? So we want to have a whole range of options, things that we can choose from. If one thing doesn't work, let's go back to the list and pick another, right? What is the next most viable option that we think is going to likely work here? So help folks brainstorm as many different solutions to a particular problem as possible. And once you do that, kind of begin to sort of work with folks to sort of evaluate and choose what's going to be the best solution, right? Yeah, and having options can help give hope when people are feeling overwhelmed. And I think that's absolutely the case, right? So I appreciate that coming through on chat as well. Even just knowing that there's a lot of different possible steps and strategies here to addressing something, I think can be really can give folks a sense of hope when they often need it the most, right? So I appreciate you adding that as well. But again, these are sort of the basic steps involved in problem solving. And if you take a look at the manual, and hopefully many of you did take a look at the manual before the training today, there's a really, really nice problem solving worksheet and the appendix for the section on problem solving as a skill. And it will walk you through each of these different steps and sort of, and I often, when I'm doing SPR, will print these worksheets off, go over them with people when we're first teaching the skill, and I'll give folks a couple of these worksheets to take home with them, right? When they're kind of going through different kinds of things, just to try this skill out throughout the week. Now, as I'm describing all this might sound really, really intuitive, right? A lot of the steps that I'm talking about here and a lot of the basic skills of, sort of identifying a problem, making it objective, setting a goal, brainstorming solutions, evaluating them, those are things that we intuitively do a lot, right? And often when I'm working with survivors will sort of echo that sense of like, yeah, this makes sense. This is intuitively what I do. But why can it be so important to actually go over this in a structured way with a worksheet, right? That breaks it down for folks in a way that you can sit there and look at and see. I think there's a real reason why it's valuable to do that, especially in the context of early trauma and disaster intervention. Maybe to kind of to sort of build on that, I'll give you an example of why I think it can be so important. One case that particularly stands out to me where I've used problem solving and it really, I think, was valuable and beneficial for a whole host of reasons for the individual that I was working with was actually in the context of an early intervention study that our team just wrapped up on skills for psychological recovery for sudden loss survivors. And in the context of one particular case, I was working with a recently bereaved mother in her late 40s, I believe, whose son had recently completed suicide within the month prior, I believe. And one of the things that in the context of information gathering came out from her, she was talking was just that she really was noticing difficulty sort of being engaged in the family in the way that she wanted to be. She still had a daughter that she was taking care of. Her partner also lived in the home with her as well, but she felt really withdrawn from folks in her family and talked about things that she wanted to be able to do just on a day in, day out basis with her family, but wasn't sure where to even start because it felt like her entire world had just crumbled, right? And had crashed in that death. And so in thinking through some things, we decided to kind of use problem solving skills. And I remember one of the things that we did in working with problem solving to think about how can I be more engaged with my family in the way that I want to be was to break down some specific actionable steps, right? And for her, first thing that she thought of was, I haven't actually made dinner or cooked a meal for my family since my son died. And that would be great. I would feel really good about myself if I could do that again. So we sat down and wrote that down as kind of the problem and talked about what the goal would be, right? If I were able to do that, what would the goal be from that, right? What is it that I need? And part of that was that, I really need to be able to create conditions where my family can know that I'm there for them and that they can start to heal too, right? Some sense of normalcy would be great to have there. So we started brainstorming things that she could cook, right? Things that she wanted to cook. And so it kind of became a process of, well, that would be really good, but that's going to take way too long. And I think that that's going to push it. I'm not quite ready to spend that much time in the kitchen yet. I don't know that I could get it done, right? So how do we brainstorm some things that would be simpler to cook, right? That I'd be likely to actually accomplish. So we literally just sat down and thought through all kinds of meals that she could make that would be fairly simple to do. And as we went through this process, I still remember to this day sitting next to her and looking over, and she had tears in her eyes. And she was sort of crying, and she looked at me and she said, "This is all stuff that I know, but I just forgot how to do it because it just has felt so overwhelming to even think about where to start." And so this process can be incredibly powerful for people at times when otherwise it feels we have no good sense of where to go or even how to begin just restoring different things in our day-to-day life, right? So, I think that there's a lot of power in problem solving, and it can be very, very useful for a number of different situations and helps establish structure. I saw that on chat come across as well, right? Just being able to sort of think through steps in a structured way for people helps restore a sense of safety almost as well, but when in the aftermath of a trauma or disaster where things can often feel very unsafe. So these are the basic sort of steps involved in problem solving. And we're going to talk a little bit about this throughout the day. And again, we'll come back to this in our breakout room session later. But one thing that I'll also add, again, be flexible with problem solving in terms of, thinking about adaptations for folks that you're working with, particularly if you're working with children and youth, right? There's probably some unique considerations you want to have in mind here. And you'll also want to be mindful of individual and cultural diversity in terms of thinking about problem solving, and I'm going to make some specific suggestions about that in just a second. But one thing that I might also suggest for folks that are doing this kind of activity with kids in particular, right? When you're working with younger folks, rather than just jumping into defining problems, sometimes it can be really, really important to focus on sort of building rapport first, right? Making sure that you engage in some good rapport building kinds of activities. And to help establish rapport with kids, starting an exercise like this you can actually, I think, start an exercise like this in a way to help build rapport by, instead of asking kids to think about, identifying concerns and problems, have them start by just thinking about strengths and things that they're really good at, and make lists of things that they're really, really good at that they can bring to the table, because that can be helpful when you start brainstorming solutions to different problems, right? So, I think starting there can be a great place to go, especially when you're working with youth and with young folks in particular. But again, we have to also be mindful, I think, of individual background, cultural background. And that's going to be especially important as we start thinking about how to evaluate and choose solutions. So how do you decide on which solution that you brainstormed to address a particular problem? How is that going to play in? So if we go to the next slide, one thing that I think we have to also all be mindful of here is that in helping survivors decide on the best solution to actually use for a particular problem, remember that some cultures emphasize the importance of shared decision-making more than others. I think that we often, there sometimes can be an instinctive bias, I think, to think in a very individualistic sense, in the sense that we live in a very individualistic sort of society in many ways. But in many cultures, there's going to be a lot more emphasis on the importance of shared decision-making with matriarchs in the family, with elders or others within the family or the community. So make sure to just ask when you're doing this kind of work, are there others in your immediate network, in your social network? And Dr. Hamrick's going to talk about sort of how to identify that with folks and think through how people may be important in this role. But ask, are there other people that need to be included in the final solution, right? And how do we best include them in that process? And the example that we're going to give when we talk about role plays later will sort of highlight a case where I think that was particularly relevant and what we decided to do. But again, this is, just some important factors to keep in mind, that as you're going through this process with folks, you may not immediately select a solution in session with people the first time you start to introduce this activity, right? It may be that you brainstorm solutions, but then have to kind of help the survivor figure out who else they're going to need to be involved in the process when it comes to actually like selecting the final solution and sort of implementing it and putting it into action, right? So who else needs to be here to help make that decision? And so if we can go to the next slide, final slide here. This is one thing that I'll just sort of say to wrap up before I hand it off to Dr. Hamburg to talk a bit about social support. Because SPR is a multi-session intervention, so while PFA, psychological first aid, and acute crisis interventions can involve multiple sessions, it's more typical than not that they don't. But with skills for psychological recovery, we often encourage and have the opportunity for a handful of follow-up sessions. And if you assign specific problem-solving skills, if you assign a problem-solving worksheet, you go through a particular problem with somebody, it's important to follow up on it. So even if you only spend a couple of sessions reviewing this particular skill with people, follow up on the problems that they originally identified. And it's going to be important to follow up on this just like you would if you were assigning homework in the context of any other sort of psychological or behavioral treatment, right? If you give folks homework to do, follow up on it because it conveys importance and it shows that you remembered and cared enough to ask, right? So come back and sort of ask, how did it go when you tried this skill out? And that also gives you an opportunity, I think, to sort of modify anything as needed, figure out if you need to tweak any particular strategies as appropriate, select something else. And then you can also sort of use that as an opportunity to help people think about, all right, this skill set worked for this particular problem. Let's think about some other problems that we could use this with too, and sit down and start walking through that together with folks. And giving folks a little bit of time to be able to think through how to use these skills for different problems can really be important in helping sort of drive the structure of this approach home. So with that, do folks have any questions before I hand it off to Dr. Hambrick to talk a bit about how do we identify social circles, right? And the people that sometimes can be important in making shared decisions when it comes to selecting solutions for problems. All right, if there's no questions right now, if you think of any, feel free to ask, but we'll continue talking about this throughout sort of the training today. And I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Hambrick, who's going to talk with us a bit about sort of another very important core skill in this process, which is sort of helping people rebuild healthy social supports.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to kind of skip around the skills just a little bit, just when thinking about which skills might go well together in terms of timing. So we're actually going to skip all the way to the 6th skill. But for those of you that have been with us through the introductory webinars that we did, through our psychological first aid work, you know that we keep coming around to just how important social connections and healthy relationships are when people have faced any type of trauma. And so, of course, this theme is coming back around again here in the SPR manual, but this time in a really kind of focused, skill-focused way that we'll discuss. So go ahead and move to the next slide, please. And just to kind of reiterate, social support is really one of the most consistently identified protective factors in studies of disaster survivors. People who have really great pre-existing social support networks tend to have better recovery trajectories. People who are able to build and establish and maybe even renew social supports in the face of trauma or disaster tend to have better recovery trajectories. And I'm sure we can all think of lots of reasons why this is the case. We've talked in some of our previous trainings about how, trauma exposure can really affect you at a biological level. It leads to biological responses like fight, flight, flee. And one that we don't talk about a whole lot, but that is really part of that whole continuum is flock. We tend to flock together. We tend to try to find others during times of stress and crisis because we know, kind of a strength in numbers type thing, we're going to be more likely to do well if we have others to rely on. But I also think that somewhere deep down in our biology or our cultural upbringings, we know that we are going to be safer and that we are going to be able to better soothe our stress response if we are in the presence of others who can calm us and support us. In the really early days following disaster, social sharing and getting together and talking about what happened is super common. We see this, those moments and days after there's a loss, after there's a trauma. People tend to call loved ones. Loved ones tend to reach out. When we think about the time frame in which SPR is meant to be delivered, you deliver it in about the 2 to 6 week range. And quite frankly, this is when some of those initial supports start to wear off, where supports in an individual system might think, well, I reached out right around the time of the loss, or I reached out and brought dinner over right around the time that the bad thing happened. And then we kind of see those supports begin to naturally wane. So what we have in this 2 to 6 week window is still a really high need for all types of different supports. And we'll talk about what some of those different supports are. And also, I think kind of a natural lessening of the amount of support readily available in one's environment, kind of in some ways putting the onus on the survivor, the person who was affected by the trauma, to be the one reaching out, which can be a really hard thing to do when your stress response system is still revved up, and when you might even be feeling more overwhelmed now that the initial shock and rush of it all, and maybe your adrenaline levels have tapered off a little bit and you're just starting to feel exhausted than you were previously. So there's still a high need, but in many ways, this is a harder time to get the support that you need. So focusing on it like a skill and helping people build the skill of asking for and getting the supports they need is critical during this time. Next slide. So one of the ways that at least the Skills for Psychological Recovery approach would suggest helping during this time, again, in a really skill-focused manner, is to help people develop what we call a social connections map. This is a simple tool, but again, the importance of thinking about it and helping people implement a plan to get the support they need is kind of where the important element of this comes in. And so when working with survivors, it can be helpful. And this map is in the appendix of the SPR manual. So for those of you who've downloaded it, you can kind of shift to the back and find copies of this map that you can print out. I would even recommend laminating this type of thing and having those, gosh, I can't think of the right word, right? But the markers that you can just wipe them off after use, that sort of thing. Just having this as part of your toolkit that you bring around. And so, have the person write their name in the center of the circle. And then kind of similar to the process that Dr. Williams was just talking about, have them really just brainstorm names of people, pets, professionals, organizations that are part of their social network. And I would typically try to orient people to things that are part of their social network now, but also things that have been part of their social network in the past, right? Because people's lives change. Sometimes we drift away from religious communities, or we drift away from maybe therapeutic groups that we used to be a part of because we didn't need them anymore. But gosh, what if I did, call on my tennis friends, right? Haven't seen them in a couple years, but that's a group of people that I did used to be connected to, right? That type of thinking. And, add as many lines as needed, but really spending some time here thinking about people at all different levels. I might even cue people. So when people are feeling stressed, their problem solving skills, it's not easy for them to access them. So I always think, how can I give people cues to help this brainstorming process go the best that it can go? Right. So who are people in your immediate or extended family? What about close friends? What about friends that were really more just acquaintances, but maybe you've had a significant connection with them? What about teachers? What about people who have cared for your children, taught your children in the past? Right? Giving them as many ideas as possible. Community groups. Have you ever been part of an organization? especially because depending on the nature of the traumatic event, sometimes the individual that you're working with was the only person who was affected. Okay, maybe it was an individual trauma. In the context of a mass scale disaster, you're going to want this social connections map to be as comprehensive as possible, because it's highly likely that a lot of people they're going to list on this map are also people that have been affected in one way or another by the same disaster. All right, next slide, please. And then after you've got this big list, right, of people, whether they're close or not very close. Again, this is another thing that's in the appendix of the SPR manual. You want to start thinking about what are specific things we could reach out to individuals for. And I think about this, and I'm like guilty of it myself. I don't know how many times somebody has gone through a hard time and I'm like, let me know if I can do anything. It's like this open-ended, like, I'd love to help, but I'm not willing to throw out any specifics, and I'm just going to put that on you. And then, the person who's going through the hard time is like, well, I mean, gosh, I could really use like 8 different things, but it feels weird to ask you for that specific thing, And so we're trying to help people navigate this world of asking for what they need at a time that they already feel deflated and defeated, which is kind of socially uncomfortable, right? So giving them as specific of a template, a plan, a script as possible, I think can be really helpful. So after we've got this great list of individuals and supports, helping them think through who are your most important connections right now in terms of people you're trying to take care of, in terms of people that it might feel easy and natural to receive support from. And then who are people that can fill these really different types of social support roles? I mean, you all can probably take a minute and think about people in your life that you're willing to share hard feelings with. Right? Probably a few specific people came to mind. Maybe even some people that you're close to that you wouldn't share hard feelings with came to mind, right? Not everybody in our life plays the same role. Who could give you advice to help you with recovery? Who maybe has some sort of knowledge in the medical or mental health or insurance issues that you're dealing with? I mean, that comes up a lot in the context of disaster. My house has just been destroyed. Do I know somebody that's good with law and insurance companies that could help me make calls and ask for the right thing? Who do you want to just spend time with socially in the next couple of weeks? And in a future training, we'll talk about positive activity scheduling and scheduling just positive time with people that you don't even have to be talking about what happened to you. It's just a good time can also be really key, right? You might even call on an acquaintance for that. I'm going to go, window shopping with so-and-so because I know they won't press me for details. We kind of have that distant relationship and I kind of need that right now. Who might be able to help you with practical tasks? Do you have that person who loves to help with errands? Are you part of a religious community where maybe they have a committee that oversees things like this and that could help facilitate just getting some of your basic needs met? And also, quite importantly, who might need your help or support right now? So again, you might be working with somebody in the context of a shared trauma. And even if you aren't, building efficacy and helping people understand that even though there are parts of their life that aren't maybe going the way that they imagined they could go right now, they are not completely useless. They have not lost their own skills. And so is there a way that they can also be involved in some social giving, right? And, we want to tread lightly on that because we don't want to overly stress people. But the literature does show that when we can help people be part of mutual social relationships, it can be really psychologically beneficial. Next slide. Any thoughts or ideas coming up now? Feel free to put them in the chat. We don't have quite as big of a group today, so sometimes that creates a little space for you all to throw out ideas yourselves. I want to talk a little bit here about some developmental considerations. So this the slide that I just showed you was some follow-up questions that might be more appropriate if you're working with an adult or maybe an adolescent, or at least an older adolescent. This chart right here is kind of a way to talk this through if you're working with a younger child. So in the problem solving section, Dr. Williams was kind of talking about how, gosh, we're not going to really want to do anything task-like or school-like or work-like unless we have a relationship with someone, unless we feel as if there's some mutual trust. And just like he said, that's perhaps even more important when we're talking about children for whom the presence of an adult, especially adult they don't know, might be kind of novel and overwhelming. So always focusing on your relationship first, maybe as one of those key relationships that can facilitate some positive change in the child. But then also thinking about, how can I make the task of generating ideas as easy as possible for this child, right? So sometimes what you might want to do is a little bit of modeling. So Christy, can you actually go back 2 slides really quick, and then we'll flip back to this one. Right, but when you're kind of looking at this spoke right here, you might even draw out a sample of yours to show them what this task is all about, right? So in my life, I have a black lab, and I have this coach that he and I coach the soccer team together, right? And just giving a couple examples of social support in your own life to get the wheels turning in a child's head. Often they're going to respond to parallel activities a little better than like call and response, like tell me everyone that you know, right? But if you're doing it and showing, then they might spontaneously actually start adding to their list. And as soon as they start to do that, you can kind of become the note taker, like, oh yeah, that is a great idea. Let's make sure that we get that one down. So go ahead and flip 2 slides over again, please. Thanks. If kids are having trouble generating ideas for that, little map, another thing that you might try is art. Just pull out a sheet of paper and just say, when you think about important people, what comes to mind? And see if they might be willing to draw or depict people or spaces that are important to them. Another thing I like to do, and I wanted to have some of my examples with me, but this afternoon went a little differently than I expected, is sometimes, in my like go bag for therapy or for things like this, I'll have 4 or 5 stuffed animals that all kind of look different, have kind of different personas, maybe a teddy bear, maybe a bunny, right? I've even got a sloth. That tends to bring up a lot of fun stuff when I work with kids, just because it's so different than the animals they normally see. And I'll just kind of have a group, and I'll say, who might this person be? Who might this person represent? And ask those sorts of questions and see if that can get them playing along. And I would also potentially use kind of those strategies and implements here when reviewing a map once they came up with some ideas, right? And these questions are similar to the ones that we would ask adults, just a little different. Who can you talk with about your feelings? Maybe if needed, which animal do they point to? Who can give you advice? Which one do you want to play a game with? What's your favorite game? Do you want to play that game with this person or that one? Okay, why? Who can help you get things done? Who do you want to help you feel better? Right? But just being open-ended and exploratory, and really not being afraid for this process to take some time, I think will be key in terms of helping get a sense for what can really help. Another final really important thing to keep in mind when you're working with kids who've just experienced something really bad is that sometimes the way that they respond is to actually be overly compliant. They don't want to make you upset. They don't want to bring any other stress. So it might be easy for them to just agree. And you'll say something and they'll, right? And so kind of keeping in mind that we want to let them generate as much as they can instead of suggesting things, because no matter what we suggest, they're probably going to say, even though it might not actually be a great idea in their minds. All right, next slide, please. So another thing to kind of keep in mind is if we are on the end of the spectrum where we are hoping to give support, or maybe we're even helping contact individuals in this person's life who we're hoping can give support, there are some, best practices for doing that. Really being thoughtful about what kind of problem the person is facing and considerations related to that problem. Thinking about the types of support that we're naturally good at giving. I'm kind of a problem solution oriented person. And so sometimes I have to remind myself, like, Erin, right now is just for listening. Like, that's really all that's needed right now. Nobody wants a solution. Trying to find the right time. When is a good time for you to receive some support or to talk with me about this, and also the right space and place. Some people would prefer some privacy, or some people, this process is not going to go well, or they're not going to feel as if they receive social support if their young one is nearby, because that's the only thing that they can focus on at that time. Offer to help, but don't push help on people. I think a lot of people who want to help following disasters and traumas, we do that because we want to help, but remembering that inaction and doing it on the person's pace is probably most respectful. And always providing help, again, in a sensitive way where we let the person actually tell us what we need, again, instead of assuming what they could use. Next slide. All right, I guess I'm jumping around a little bit here with some developmental considerations, but I did just want to say a word here. Sometimes what we see in the face of disaster trauma is, in terms of kids, we see kids actually perhaps seeking a lot more social support than they used to, which is good in so many ways because they're expressing their needs and communicating their needs, but it can also be confusing for care providers and for parents and others involved in the child's life to kind of know, what do we do here? So one note that I want to make is, I write up here supporting children who are clingy, but I don't actually love that term. I don't think it's all that child-centered. And so I prefer to say things like children who are expressing like a really strong need for security, that are expressing that they don't feel well when people that they trust aren't around, right? We see increases in clinginess after bad things happen for a reason. That's an expression of something. And how do we balance this truly increased need in many, many, many children for relational support with the need to kind of get kids back on track with their routines and activities that we know will be healthy for them, right? So one thing I kind of talk about is that increase is normal, and it normally will kind of die down over time. So sometimes we just have to let things work themselves out, right? We have to trust that time is going to be on our side. But we also want to focus on consistency, telling children when we're going to be physically available to them, when we're only going to be available by phone, right? Being really clear about that. Giving them some choices related to how they want their bedtime routine, for example, to look. Do they want an extra book? Do they want their back rubs as they fall asleep kind of during this time? Thinking about timed separations. So, okay, we're gonna say goodbye to each other, but it's only gonna be for 10 minutes. And I'll even set my timer so that we make sure it doesn't go longer than 10 minutes, right? So kind of practicing some small separations and using time as a way to help give the child some security, and then making sure we do return when we said that we would. Increasing other supports when you're away, right? So communicating with the school and saying, this has happened. I've noticed that my child needs me more at home. Who can be a support to them at school? And how can we be clear with my child about how they could contact me throughout the day if they needed to? But also really considering cultural norms here. Different cultures have different ways of coming together following trauma and disaster. And we never want to impute what we think is right onto other cultures. So even though in many ways it can be great to help kids return to consistency and kind of normal separations as quickly as possible, we also don't want to push it to the extent that it feels culturally incongruent for any family. Next slide. And final thing here, just some final considerations about how to go about this social support process while keeping some key things in mind that you don't really want to miss, that hopefully you got at least a hint about during that information gathering process that you can be really attuned to here. So has the person actually lost someone as part of the disaster or trauma because that person was probably an important social support in their life? And you are going to want to take great care in terms of how you talk with them and work with them on getting social supports when perhaps they've lost an important one. Does the person have a history of highly unsafe relationships? Do you have a sense, did they tell you during information gathering that they are, for example, a domestic abuse survivor, right? This might be a case where you might think about sooner than later actively connecting them with some more traditional mental health supports or services. And is the person struggling to focus on the present or the future such that they can even engage in this type of exercise? Is this skill problem solving so difficult for them that you're really unable to get that done? And if so, that might be another reason to kind of think about, maybe I really want part of my role here to be actively connecting them with a higher level of care.